Looks like break time's over. Lock and load. Hell yeah, brother.
In the mid-1980s, Konami was absolutely on fire. They figured out the secret formula for producing hits. Gradius was dominating arcades with its space shooter brilliance. Track and Field had people destroying joysticks trying to run faster. Metal Gear was quietly revolutionizing stealth gameplay. This was Konami's golden age, and their designers seemed to operate on a completely different level than everyone else in the industry. But the gaming landscape they were working in was crowded, competitive, and honestly a little stale when it came to shooters. You see, if you walked into an arcade in 1985, you had 3 flavors of shooting games to choose from. And none of them were perfect. You had your fixed screen shooters like Galaxian, where you moved in limited space and waited for waves of enemies to descend. Classic stuff, but nothing revolutionary. And then you had vertical scrolling shooters like Gradius and R-Type. Great games, but they felt detached. And you had top-down military shooters like Capcom's Commando and SNK's Ikari Warriors. These put you on the ground as a soldier, which was cool, but the movement was stiff, the pacing was slow, and the platforming was basically non-existent. Nobody had figured out how to combine the visceral thrill of ground combat with the precision of platforming and the speed of arcade action. Nobody had made a shooter that felt like you were actually in a Rambo movie or fighting alongside the Colonial Marines from Aliens. The pieces were all there in the culture. Sylvester Stallone was blowing up box offices, Arnold Schwarzenegger had just starred in Predator, and James Cameron's Aliens had terrified and thrilled audiences with its biomechanical nightmares. The world was hungry for muscular heroes mowing down impossible odds, but video games hadn't quite delivered that fantasy yet. Then, in February of 1987, Konami dropped Contra into Japanese arcades, and suddenly everything clicked. The timing was almost absurdly perfect, and also a bit controversial. The arcade version arrived just months after the Iran-Contra affair that had exploded across international headlines, embroiling the Reagan administration in scandal. While Konami never officially confirmed whether they named the game after the Nicaraguan Contra rebels, the ending theme of that original arcade release was titled Sandinista, directly referencing the adversaries of the real-life Contras. Coincidence? Or deliberate provocation? Nobody knows for certain, but it did give the game an edge before players even touched the joystick. What really mattered, though, was what happened when you actually started playing. 2 commandos named Bill Reiser and Lance Bean were dropped into an alien-infested jungle, and within seconds you understood that this was something different. The sprites themselves were modeled on Arnold Schwarzenegger's publicity photos from Predator. Artist Bob Wakelin later admitted as much when discussing his iconic box art, calling it straight up a Predator Aliens mashup. This was 1987. Macho military sci-fi was the cultural moment, and Contra captured it perfectly. The arcade cabinet itself was unusual. It featured a vertical screen orientation, the kind typically reserved for space shooters. For a game with horizontally scrolling platform action, this was a strange choice. But it worked brilliantly for the pseudo 3D-based infiltration strategies where players pushed forward into the screen, and it gave the massive alien bosses an overwhelming sense of scale. When you faced down Emperor Demon Dragon God Java at the end of the game, though American players knew him simply as Red Falcon, he filled that vertical screen with terrifying presence. Contra stood out because its controls were incredibly tight and responsive at a time when many shooters felt stiff or sluggish. You could jump precisely, fire in 8 directions while moving, and trust that deaths were fair, even if they were frequent. The simple but powerful weapon system, especially the fan-favorite spread gun, added meaningful strategy and real tension when you lost upgrades. And co-op pushed it even further. Ikari Warriors had offered 2-player simultaneous action, but Contra elevated it into something special, fast, chaotic, and demanding real coordination. In 1987, nothing else delivered that kind of synchronized high-speed action. The arcade success made a home console port inevitable, and in 1988, Contra arrived on the Nintendo Entertainment System. But this wasn't just a simple conversion, it was a complete reimagining. The NES hardware couldn't replicate those pseudo 3D-based stages, but it tried. The stages were longer and more varied than the arcade original. The pacing shifted towards memorization-based gameplay that rewarded repeated attempts. In many ways, the NES version became the definitive Contra experience, the one that an entire generation remembers most vividly. Japanese players got a more advanced Famicom version of Contra thanks to Konami's VRC-2 chip, which allowed extra animations and story cutscenes that were cut from the North American NES release due to cartridge limitations. But American players got something just as iconic: the Konami code. Originally created as a Gradius testing tool, the famous up-up-down-down sequence gave players 30 lives, essential for surviving Contra's brutal difficulty, and became permanently tied to the game, growing into one of the most recognizable cheat codes in pop culture history. In Europe, strict German censorship laws meant that Contra couldn't release in its original form, so Konami rebranded it as Probotector and replaced the human soldiers and enemies with robots. The gameplay stayed the same, but the entire look changed, creating an alternate version of the series that would define Contra in Europe for years. Super Contra arrived in arcades just 1 year later,
proving that Konami had no intention of slowing down.
The sequel replaced those pseudo 3D base stages with top-down vertical scrolling sections. It pushed the chaos further with more aggressive enemy patterns, larger explosions, and improved sprite animation. The arcade version featured upgradable weapons and variable jump heights. Everything felt faster, louder, more intense. The NES adaptation landed in 1990 as Super C, and while it lacked those upgradable weapons, it compensated with 3 entirely new stages and a new final boss. Super C delivered exactly what fans expected: more relentless action, more incredible music, more 8-bit destruction. If at times it feels standard from a modern perspective, that's only because it helped shape every side-scrolling shooter that followed, like Gunstar Heroes and Metal Slug. Portable fans got their moment in 1991 when the game launched for the Game Boy. And despite the hardware limitations, it captured the essence of the series remarkably well. It also introduced the homing gun power-up, a first for the franchise. But there was one painful omission: no multiplayer. Going gung-ho solo felt wrong for a series that was built on cooperative chaos. And then Contra stumbled badly. Contra Force released for the NES in 1992, and despite some promising ideas like 4 selectable characters with unique weapon configurations, a power-up system that was similar to Gradius, and genuinely good music, the game was nearly unplayable. Crippling sprite flickering and slowdown plagued every stage. Contra Force was never supposed to be a Contra game at all. It was originally developed in Japan under the title Arkhound, a completely unrelated project. When that Japanese release got cancelled, someone decided to repurpose it for America by slapping the Contra name on it. The game lacked everything that defined the series. No alien invaders, no futuristic environments, just an elite task force fighting human terrorists in a present-day setting. But 1992 also spectacularly brought redemption. Contra 3, The Alien Wars, launched for the Super Nintendo, and it remains one of the greatest action games ever created. Under developer Nobuya Nakazoto's direction, the series reached new heights. Players could now carry 2 weapons simultaneously, switching between them with a button press. The SNES's Mode 7 capabilities enabled rotating top-down stages and jaw-dropping set pieces, including a motorcycle chase that climaxed with the main character riding missiles through mid-air combat. The sprites were massive, the explosions cinematic, the intensity never relented. Contra 3 frequently appears on greatest games of all time lists, and having played it recently, I can confirm it absolutely holds up. The side-scrolling stages flow beautifully, the bosses are memorable monstrosities, and that sense of controlled chaos where everything seems impossible until suddenly you're doing it remains unmatched. If I had to recommend one Contra game to someone who had never touched the series, Alien Wars would be my immediate answer. But Konami wasn't content dominating just one console. In 1994, Contra Hardcore arrived for the Sega Genesis, and it pushed the franchise in ambitious new directions. Players could choose from 4 distinct characters, each with completely unique weapons and abilities. Branching story paths led to multiple endings, encouraging repeated playthroughs. And the difficulty? Absolutely ferocious. Hardcore pushed the Genesis hardware to its limits with screen-filling bosses and relentless enemy waves. I personally think that Hardcore is underrated. It's faster, more experimental, and it has this anime-influenced energy that feels distinct from earlier entries. The character variety alone adds tremendous replay value. But Hardcore was so different that many fans didn't know what to make of it. This was exactly why the 2011 prequel Uprising dropped the Contra name from its title. Fans regarded Hardcore as somehow separate from the main series. It's been retroactively classified as a spin-off alongside its sequels. By the end of 1996, the Contra series had accumulated combined sales exceeding 4 million units worldwide. The name meant something. It represented grade A, top-notch arcade action. It promised some of the best music the NES could produce and countless hours of excitement and replayability. Contra was a title so good that it was worth buying an NES strictly to own it. And then the franchise fell off a cliff. Times were changing. The Sony PlayStation had arrived with its revolutionary 3D capabilities. The Sega Saturn was pushing polygons in ways that nobody thought possible. The Nintendo 64 was promising to transform how games looked and played. Every beloved franchise seemed poised for reinvention, and surely Konami would bring Contra into this brave new dimension with the same brilliance they had shown so far. What we received instead was the last thing we wanted. In 1996, Contra Legacy of War launched, marking the series' first attempt at full 3D gameplay. But Konami didn't develop it themselves. They let Appaloosa Interactive take control. A respectable developer, but one completely inexperienced with what made Contra special. The results were painful. Legacy of War adopted an isometric perspective that stripped away the precision platforming that fans loved. The camera struggled constantly, movement felt clunky and imprecise. The tight controls that had defined every previous entry were replaced by something sluggish and frustrating. The game was originally sold with a pair of anaglyph 3D glasses, as if the gimmick might distract players from the fundamental problems with the gameplay. Yeah, it didn't work. Critics savaged the game. But Legacy of War did accomplish one dubious milestone. It was the first console Contra game released in PAL regions without any changes. Unfortunately, this was the worst possible game to serve as that introduction. Appaloosa got another chance in 1998 with C: The Contra Adventure. And while this sequel attempted to course correct by mixing 2D side-scrolling stages with 3D sections, the execution still fell short. The side-scrolling portions showed glimpses of what a proper Contra game should feel like, but they were sandwiched between 3D stages that inherited all the problems from Legacy of War. Even more disappointing, it was the only console game in the entire series to lack a multiplayer mode. Contra without co-op felt fundamentally wrong, like ordering a pizza without cheese. The franchise had hit rock bottom. Those two Appaloosa entries are largely ignored by everyone today. The transition to 3D that had worked brilliantly for franchises like Mario and Zelda had proven disastrous for Contra, and many feared that Contra was finished. But something was brewing at Konami. Shortly after the PlayStation 2 launched in 2000, Konami tightened their belt and got back to business. In 2002, Contra Shattered Soldier arrived, and it announced its intentions immediately. This was a return to hardcore 2D roots. Gone was the traditional weapon pickup system that had defined Contra since 1987. Instead, players now had a fixed weapon configuration, 3 weapons available from the start that could be switched between freely. Shattered Soldier also introduced a ranking system that graded player performance on each stage, and only the players who achieved above-average ranks could access the true ending. Honestly, I have mixed feelings about Shattered Soldier. The return to 2D gameplay was absolutely the right call, and the boss designs are genuinely spectacular. But that fixed weapon system removes some of the chaos and desperation that made the earlier games so thrilling, and the grim industrial aesthetic, while well executed, lacks the pulpy action movie charm of Contra 3. It's a quality game that knows exactly what it wants to be. I just wish it wanted to be something slightly more fun. 2 years later, in 2004, Neo Contra pushed experimentation even further.
Most of the game abandoned side-scrolling entirely, instead adopting an isometric perspective that recalled the troubled PlayStation entries but executed it with far greater competence.
The action was faster, the controls were tighter, and the sheer ridiculousness of the set pieces went through the roof. Running across spinning helicopter blades while blasting missiles out of the air was exactly the kind of absurdity that the series needed after Shattered Soldier's dour tone. Neo let players select their weapon configurations before missions, including a new weapon type that locked onto airborne enemies. The emphasis was on score attack, replayability, and relentless difficulty. It wasn't a return to the classic side-scrolling formula, but it was a bold and confident reimagining built around pure, high-skill action. But after it, Konami seemed to lose interest entirely. Years passed without any major console releases. The next proper entry didn't arrive until 2007, and it came from an unexpected source. Contra 4 was developed not by Konami internally, but by Way Forward Technologies, an American studio known for their expertise in 2D game development. The result was a love letter to everything that fans cherished about the classic games. Running on the Nintendo DS, Contra 4 utilized both screens to create vertically expansive stages. A new grappling hook mechanic allowed players to latch onto railings and swing across gaps. The weapon system returned to its traditional pickup-based format, complete with upgradable weapons similar to Super Contra. Contra 4 was modeled directly after Alien Wars, recapturing that specific blend of speed, challenge, and spectacle. The pseudo 3D tunnel stages from the original 1987 arcade game made their triumphant return.
And unlockable characters and challenge modes added tremendous replay value.
The difficulty was absolutely insane. Even on easy mode, the game punished mistakes severely, but that's what a Contra title should be. Then, in 2009, Konami released Contra Rebirth for WiiWare, developed by M2. This 2D side-scroller featured hand-drawn, sprite-based visuals, and starred Bill Rizer alongside Genbei Yagyu from Neo Contra fighting off yet another alien invasion. The game included 2 unlockable characters and a nightmare mode for players who found the standard difficulty too forgiving. Rebirth delivered exactly what its title promised: a return to the fundamental pleasures of classic Contra with modern polish. But as a digital exclusive WiiWare title, it existed only on Nintendo's online storefront. When the Wii Shop channel closed in 2019, Contra Rebirth became impossible to purchase legally. Players who hadn't bought it during its availability window were simply out of luck. Rebirth exists in a digital limbo. It's a genuine shame because this is one of the better modern Contra experiences, now accessible only to those who already owned it or through less legitimate means. 2 years later, in 2011, Hardcore Uprising arrived on Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network. Developed by Arc System Works, the studio behind Guilty Bear and BlazBlue, the gameplay was unmistakably Contra. Side-scrolling action, punishing difficulty, cooperative play, and screen-filling bosses. But the visual style was pure anime, with character designs that looked transplanted from a fighting game. The game was a prequel to Hardcore, set 20 years before the original 1987 game. Players controlled Colonel Bahamut, who had been the main antagonist of the 1994 Genesis title. The game was released with 2 playable characters, with additional fighters added through downloadable content. As a digital-only release, it shares some of Rebirth's accessibility concerns, though the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 stores have remained more stable than the Wii Shop channel. For what it's worth, Uprising represents a genuinely radical reinvention of the franchise. Arc System Works brought their signature visual flair and mechanical precision to the formula, creating something that felt fresh while honoring the series' brutal legacy. Between Rebirth and Uprising, Konami began shifting away from traditional console games, focusing instead on mobile titles and pachinko machines. From 2009 to 2017, Contra saw several mobile releases and multiple slot machine adaptations, including Contra 3D in Japanese pachinko parlors and Neo Contra-themed slots in North America, while no major console entries appeared. The years of neglect did Konami no favors when they finally attempted a major console comeback. In September of 2019, Contra Rogue Corps launched. For the first time since Neo Contra in 2004, this was a Konami-developed title. It seemed that the company had finally listened to the audience clamoring for a proper revival. Rogue Corps was not that revival. The game abandoned side-scrolling entirely for a top-down twin-stick shooter perspective. The shooting mechanics were inaccurate and unsatisfying. Muddy textures and low resolution made for an ugly experience, particularly on the Switch. The story was forgettable, the missions felt repetitive, and the overall package landed with more of a whimper than a bang. Set years after Contra 3, the Alien Wars, in a location called the Damned City, Rogue Corps brought back the Kaiser character from that classic entry and surrounded him with bounty hunters that nobody particularly cared about. Reviews were harsh. Fan reception was harsher. The game represented everything wrong with how legacy franchises get mishandled. A beloved name slapped onto a generic product that failed to understand what made the original game special. Now, alongside the disappointing Rogue Corps release, Konami launched several anniversary collections celebrating their classic catalogs. The Contra Anniversary Collection bundled together many of the franchise's finest moments. The original arcade Contra, Super Contra, the NES versions of both games, Super C, Operation C, Contra 3 The Alien Wars, and Contra Hardcore. Japanese versions were included as well, letting Western players finally experience the Famicom releases with their additional cutscenes and the uncensored Probotector alternatives that European gamers had grown up with. And then WayForward stepped up again. The studio that had delivered Contra 4 in 2007, aka the last universally beloved entry in the franchise, returned to develop Contra Operation Galuga. Released on March 12, 2024, this wasn't just another sequel. Operation Galuga was a full reimagining of the original 1987 game, a reboot designed to recapture what made Contra legendary while updating the experience for modern players. It is an adrenaline-fueled bullet ballet that knows exactly what Contra should be. The developers borrowed key elements from across the series' back catalog while elevating the action with original movement options that feel fresh and exciting. Bill Reiser and Lance Bean return as protagonists, fighting through reimagined versions of classic stages with gorgeous hand-drawn visuals and a soundtrack that honors the franchise's musical legacy. The set pieces are spectacular. The boss fights are memorable. The cooperative chaos that defined the original arcade experience is fully present and accounted for. I genuinely think that Operation Galuga represents one of the strongest entries in the entire franchise. WayForward brought the same reverence and expertise that they demonstrated with Contra 4, but with modern production values and lessons learned from 15 additional years of game development experience. The controls are razor sharp, the difficulty is punishing but fair. Playing cooperatively with a friend recaptures that specific magic of the NES days. Friendly arguments over who gets the spread gun, the desperate scrambles when one player dies and respawns weaponless, the triumphant fist bumps when you finally conquer a boss that seemed impossible. But there's a significant caveat, and it's frustrating enough that I do need to mention it. The Nintendo Switch version of Operation Galuga suffers from technical problems that undermine the experience. Frame rate drops, visual compromises, and performance hiccups all damage what should be a smooth, responsive action game. For a franchise that's built on precision controls and split-second reactions, these technical setbacks matter enormously. The game's still playable and enjoyable on Switch, but serious Contra fans should strongly consider playing on another platform if possible. And maybe that's the most fitting summary of Contra's entire history. Brilliant highs, frustrating setbacks, and a stubborn refusal to disappear. Even when the hardware falters or the direction wavers, the core magic is still there, waiting in those split-second jumps and screen-clearing explosions. From smoky arcades to modern consoles, Contra has always been about that rush. The feeling that against impossible odds, with one life left and chaos everywhere, you might just pull it off. And for a lot of us, that feeling is timeless. Thanks for watching. If you like the video, well then support the channel by subscribing. And click that bell so that you don't miss the next one. There's a lot more gaming history on the way.